I was literally arrested for being unemployed. So how do you think I'm gonna have the money to pay the fine or the court fees here? Excuse me, Judge. I will pay this man's fine and his court fees. Okay, guy, you belong to me now. I'm sorry, what's happening here? Slavery supposedly ended in 1865, but a nearly identical system still existed in the South relatively unchecked until the 1940s. So immediately after slavery was abolished, black codes were established in many of the former Confederate states. Many people think this system was similar to segregation, but in some ways, it was even worse. Black codes were laws that were enforced in a way meant to essentially re-enslave black Americans. For example, you could get arrested for vagrancy, which included being unemployed, or for breaking a labor contract, aka quitting your job. There was even a law in South Carolina that prohibited black Americans from having any type of job outside of agriculture or domestic work. Black people could only work on farms or be maids and butlers. Sounds familiar? Violations of these ridiculous laws resulted in fines. But essentially, one of the only ways you could pay these fines was through unpaid labor for the state, which sounds a lot like, slavery. And because the legal system was so corrupt at this time, there didn't even have to be a formal charge in order to get someone convicted. In fact, that one Alabama prison mine, not given, was the largest criminal category of charges for incarcerated laborers according to a report from 1898. Court fees were added on top of the fines they owed, so it wasn't uncommon for many African Americans to just plead guilty immediately in order to avoid longer trials that would increase the fines they already owed, which is actually very similar to the plea bargain system we have in place today. This gets even crazier when we look at the process of debt peonage. Now, under the debt peonage process, someone could pay your fines and court fees for you, and you would be indebted to that person instead of the state. This would force you to provide that person with free labor until the debt was paid. Since most laborers were required to live on the properties where they worked, living expenses were often added to their debt, making these labor contracts seemingly never ending. So if you were a black person living in the South at that time, you could be forced to provide unpaid manual labor simply for being unemployed, for wanting to quit your job, or for just existing. Now you might be thinking to yourself, man, debt peonage sounds exactly like slavery. How was that even legal? Well, here's the craziest part. It wasn't. Despite the debt peonage process technically being outlawed in 1867, the federal government failed to enforce any bans against it until 1941. That was just 1 year before the current president of the United States was born. So when we look at the current prison system, in which incarcerated people are forced to work for terribly low and even no wages, we can start to see how this is just another poorly built evolution of an evil and corrupt institution.